Hi, my name is Gabriel, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan School of Information. I will talk today about a paper called Bias as Boundary Object, Unpacking the Politics of an Austerity Algorithm Using Bias Frameworks. This is joint work with Fabian Fischer and Florian Cech. In 2018, the Austrian Public Employment Services Agency introduced an algorithmic decision support system that promised to aid in distributing scarce resources efficiently. It is colloquially called the AMS algorithm and was meant to classify job seekers into three risk categories to cut support measures for those deemed at lowest and highest risk of long-term unemployment. It was presented as a fair and scientific tool meant to objectify this new allocation process. But this narrative was challenged. Various scholars and activists critiqued the system for justifying austerity politics, discrimination, and a strong lack of accountability. The picture on the right highlights a campaign by the digital rights group Epicenter Works. It is intended to illustrate to a broader audience the situation of job seekers confronted with an inscrutable algorithm that to them feels like a slot machine. The Austrian Data Protection Agency forbade the use of the AMS algorithm in 2020, but a court case challenging this decision is ongoing. In this paper, we identify biases of the algorithm using a classification framework developed by Friedman and Nissenbaum, and discuss implications, benefits, and trade-offs of using such an approach to critique problematic algorithms. Describing an algorithm as biased can mark it as contentious. For others, it may only be seen as a technical description. In the social sciences, the term is often even rejected, as technologies can never be unbiased. These conflicting valuations of bias highlight the fluidity of the concept, which we define as a placeholder construct for some phenomena understood as a distortion. Biases can become tangible, usually in the form of either a calculated number or a description of the bias. There are many different ways biases could be conceived. Some may be more useful than others, but ultimately no absolute version exists. We in turn understand biases as socially constructed. We understand biases as relational and situated, which highlights how they need to be contextualized to become tangible and debatable. For example, a recognized bias can be experienced as problematic or harmful by one social group while seen as an opportunity before others. We also understand biases as performative, which means once they are conceived and communicated as such, they become ways how people understand and feel failure, injustice, and unfairness. Some problematic biases are hidden and barely noticeable, but once they become known as such, they can turn into a bigger controversy. This political understanding of bias motivates our work to how bias can be operationalized in productive and emancipatory ways. Our study of the AMS algorithm is based on internal documents, many of which are not public, provided by the Public Employment Agency. We also engaged with civil society groups while conducting this work, such as job seeker interest groups. The initially published documents by the AMS turned out to not paint a comprehensive picture of the system. We described new insights in more detail in our paper. We learned, for example, an early version of the algorithm was intended to actually focus support on the most risky job seekers. To analyze the documents, we used qualitative document analysis as a method, which involved close reading of the documents and annotating relevant sections. Based on identified technical details, we tried to reconstruct the workings of the algorithm, but were not able to recreate an exact implementation as we didn't have access to the underlying data. We then identified possible bias of the algorithms and categorized them using the framework by Friedman and Nissenbaum. We illustrate how its three basic categories for bias can be traced. We adapted the categories slightly to make them fit the context and added subcategories of which we present a selection now in the following slides. The technical bias category is concerned with representational accuracy in light of technical constraints or consideration. It attributes accountability to human actors as design decisions are problematized. The variables fix fluid, continuous realities into supposedly stable and discrete categories. This is problematic. For example, the dichotomous health impairment variable absurdly oversimplifies disability and how it impacts possibilities for work in the labor market. This is regarding difference and representational justice in favor of supposed bureaucratic efficiency. The data and framing used to construct the model only represents a limited perspective on the labor market that always insinuates that job seekers are the ones responsible for being unemployed. The emergent bias category foregrounds changing contexts, for example, due to the passage of time or use in spaces it was not intended for. For example, norms, laws, and representations are not stable over time, but constantly change, which affects the reliability of the system and cannot be easily solved through updates, as it may take time until these changes result in stable, measurable trends, if they ever do so. Consequently, job seekers are increasingly misrepresented over time. The envisioned interface presents counselors with a classification and a score that do not provide much room for interpretation and contestation for job seekers. In fact, internal instructional materials reveal that counselors are trained to convince job seekers of the objectivity of the algorithm when they question their own classification. After the introduction of the algorithm, counseling may center questionable classifications instead of job seekers' articulated needs. The interface is also meant to aid counselors in this convincing by providing a set of a few rudimentary explanations for certain scores that can be presented to worried job seekers. Most of these are not very descriptive, and some of them are even reproduce racist and sexist stereotypes. The pre-existing bias category embodies prejudice, held values, social orders that seep into the algorithmic system through actions of institutions or individuals. In our case, this analytical bias category sensitizes us to the ways that injustices and inequalities are inscribed in the algorithm and reinforced when it's used in decision-making. The data and variables used to construct risk scores also account for historical disadvantages and discrimination on the labor market. Thus, the calculated risk of long-term unemployment of marginalized groups affected by these mechanisms is higher, which means fewer resources for these groups, with the danger of a self-reinforcing loop algorithmically optimized to exacerbate inequality. For some job seekers with incomplete data, separate models were created. For example, a model for people with migration background likely concentrates many job seekers with calculated high risk of long-term unemployment in one model, which likely makes it harder for new job seekers assigned to the model to access support measures. We argue that the articulation of bias can enable cooperation across community boundaries, because bias can be meaningfully constructed to act as a boundary object. Boundary objects are defined as adaptable to different viewpoints and robust enough to maintain their identity across them, and thereby enabling different groups to work together without consensus. For example, the AMS algorithm was initially not perceived as highly controversial. The controversy took off after coefficients in a publicized regression analysis were interpreted by interest groups and scholars as indicative of bias. They pointed to the fact that being a woman in the system was a risk factor that may entail spending cuts for this group. This reading undermined the promised objectivity of the system and mobilized people to further investigate, document the biases it may show, and question the claims of the agency. The numbers, not intended to be indicative of bias, were reinterpreted as such and then became a boundary object around which disparate groups came together to unpack issues such as discrimination. In the paper, we also discuss in more detail how questions of bias and its recognition and stabilization are also about power. In the paper, we also compare several bias frameworks, point to differences, and discuss how they could be improved. We caution to simply apply bias categories uncritically and problematize several in the paper. We further critique frameworks for putting too much focus on technical issues and thereby overemphasizing the role of individual developers. Our paper shows how organizational conditions, like how chosen variables needed to be convincing to stakeholders in the AMS algorithm, also put bounds on what options are available. The frameworks varied in granularity. We argue frameworks with more specific categories can be useful by providing more contextual and concrete guidance in analysis. Yet this can also introduce rigidity and make it easier to fall into the trap of simply following the framework without reflection. On the other hand, we argue course frameworks encourage researchers more to adapt the framework to a context and resist simple application. We argue that biases should be seen as a starting point for further analysis, such as what are deeper and historical and social explanations for their emergence? What underlying power dynamics stabilize them? And what can be done to counteract them? We also think interrogating a bias can enable fruitful conversation around what unbiased or natural states are assumed or desired, and if some of the biases should be upheld or abandoned. When bias frameworks are used, it is important for analysts to be cautious about what they make invisible and prioritize to ensure analysis is reflexive. Similarly, it is important for analysts to be aware of their own positionalities. We argue that as bias frameworks are made and reworked, they should make their perspective and epistemological commitments clearer, focus on more concrete phenomena instead of abstract terms like bias, foreground questions of power and justice, and draw from more relevant fields concerned with the social. There is a risk that these frameworks stabilize certain problematic notions of bias. For example, when they are enshrined in law. The stakes are high in matters of bias and harm, so it's important that possibilities for emancipatory debate remain open and that frameworks are circulated with this in mind. This entails constructing bias categories so they can act as useful boundary objects. Future work should seek to both critique and improve frameworks and empirically study their use and impact. Thanks for your time.